He left the splendor of heaven, knowing his destiny was the lonely hill of Golgotha, there to lay down his life for me. If that isn't love, the ocean is dry. There's no stars in the sky, and the sparrow can't fly. If that isn't love, then heaven's a myth. There's no feeling like this. If that isn't love. Don't know how many of you are familiar with that song. It is not in our songbooks, Ricky. I first was introduced to it by a CD of one of Diana's singing events. But I still remember the first time hearing that song and those lyrics. It captivated. It arrested my attention. We live amidst a people who hold many distorted concepts regarding love. But the songwriter makes this astounding affirmation in the chorus of that song. If that isn't love. Then he goes on to present the denial of realities that all would readily acknowledge and accept. Again, he says, if that isn't love, then the ocean is dry. There's no stars in the sky. The sparrow can't fly. If that isn't love, then heaven's a myth. And there is no feeling like this. You see, he bases the confidence, the assurance of what is a manifestation of true love against the denial of things that no one would deny. Realities that all of us accept. And again, I found that such a powerful way in which the songwriter makes the assertion. Because what he is saying is what he had just presented in the stanza prior to the chorus. That is so obviously, so undeniably, so certainly the very expression of true love that no one can find reason to deny it. And isn't that the case? Listen again to the lyrics of the stanza. He left the splendor of heaven, knowing his destiny was the lonely hill of Golgotha, there to lay down his life for me. You see, in those lyrics, composing that first stanza, the songwriter presents the ultimate manifestation of the purest, the highest, the truest love. That love, if you will, that originates in God. That love, if you will, can be only known because of God. That love which is God. If that isn't love, then there is no such thing as love. The second person of the Godhead, leaving heaven, its glories, its splendors, and coming to earth. That in and of itself is almost incomprehensible. But then the songwriter brings to our attention that he knew his ultimate destiny when he came. He came knowing all the while that in his decision to leave heaven, to come to this earth, it ultimately would require of him to die. A horrific death. And even though the songwriter doesn't speak to this, we know it because of what we know about the second person of the Godhead. Jesus Christ, in his pre-incarnate state, when he was with God in eternity, please understand, being God means that he had witnessed every individual who had ever been crucified. He would have heard their screams. He would have known their agonies. He would have known and witnessed the excruciating pain that each of those individuals would have gone through. In fact, I don't know if you were aware of this. I had discovered it a number of years ago. The word excruciating that we associate with pain that is almost unbearable, did you know that word is a Latin derivative from out of the crucifixion? You can almost see it. Excruciating. Out of the crucifixion. We have so come to associate excruciating pain with that horrific form of capital punishment coming out of the most corrupt human minds to inflict torturous pain upon an individual. But what I want us to remember, what I want us to embrace, what I want us to understand is that Jesus, before he came, knew what that was going to be like. And he still came. Who then could deny that such a sacrificial act on the part of God is not the consummate manifestation of love? We've been talking about a songwriter. Please understand, he is just borrowing from what we read in the Scriptures. God knows that his Son leaving heaven to come to earth, ultimately to die on Calvary's cross, is the consummate manifestation of love. And he knows how powerful that is. He knows how motivational that is. What a powerful incentive that is for us to draw upon. And so it's no wonder then, Jesus having done this wondrous act of love, that God through his word would ever keep that before the minds of his people. Again, presenting it as a powerful motivation to live a humble and obedient, a God-pleasing life before him, with the promise of going to heaven one day. Let me call your attention to a few places that I think we see God doing that in the inspired epistles of the New Testament. Look with me to 1 Peter chapter 1, please. 1 Peter chapter 1. I had the privilege Friday evening to travel to Cold Harbor Church of Christ in Mechanicsville. Their lectureship is this weekend, and it was on encouragement from 1 and 2 Peter, and I appreciate Brother Dave Miller was the speaker Friday evening. And anyways, he covered 1 Peter chapter 1. And in 1 Peter chapter 1, we find numerous exhortations by the Spirit-guided penman, Peter, to these Christians who were suffering because of their faith. Exhortations to live a certain way. For instance, you can look there in chapter 1 and verse 13, "Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, hope to the end for the grace that is brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Verse 14, as obedient children, don't fashion yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance. Rather, verse 15, be holy. Be holy. Verse 17, since you call on the Father, who without respect of persons is going to judge according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. Friends, all of those are exhortations. All of those are instructions, inspired instructions for these Christians suffering for their faith to live in a God-pleasing way. Why? What motivation is there? What compelling reason is there? Among those, look at verse 18 following, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. Why, Peter, should we so live when living that way brings persecution and suffering and hardships? Because remember what Jesus did for you. Remember that ultimate expression of His love for you, wherein He would leave heaven, come to this earth, and as a lamb going to the slaughter, would die. You see, friends, our love for God is a reciprocal love. Isn't that what John affirms? 1 John 4:19. We love Him because He first loved us. Friends, the power of a reciprocal love is that it is energized, it is empowered by the love that we have seen by God. And so it doesn't surprise me that God is constantly keeping this before us, constantly offering that as reason, as motivation, as incentive for us to do what He would have us to do. Remember the love that my Son had for you. Another occasion of this, back up to Titus. Look at Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2 is filled with, again, exhortations that correspond to sound doctrine. Chapter 2 and verse 1. Instructions with regards to Christians of every age, old men, old women, every age, young men, young women, every gender, every social status, servants. It doesn't matter. Here are instructions as to how you ought to live. What's the motivation for that? Beginning in verse 11, for the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. Mentioning Jesus at the end of verse 13, who gave Himself for us to redeem us from all iniquity, purify unto Himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. You see it? It's the motivation. It's the empowerment. It's the reasoning as to why we ought to do what we know God would have us to do. This consummate expression and demonstration of God's love for us. One final example. Well, really, I'm sorry, not the final one, two more. Look at Ephesians 5 quickly. Ephesians chapter 5. You might remember, if you know the breakdown of the epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 4 begins the practical application based upon what God has done for us out of His grace, chapters 1 through 3. This is the way then that we ought to walk in light of what Christ has done for us. And so, no surprise, chapters 4, 5, and 6 are practical in nature. It's telling us how we ought to live, but it's ever keeping before us the motivation for it. See, that's what it was based on, chapters 1 through 3. But even in the midst of those exhortations, that instructional, very practical doctrine and teaching with regards to how we ought to live, notice, if you will, chapter 5, verse 2, and walk in love. Where'd we learn that? Where'd we see that? As Christ also hath loved us. How do we know that? He has given Himself for us. An offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling savor. And then now this is the last one. Look back up one book of the Bible, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. We have formed a youth song out of it. But I mentioned this one because, like the others, it is set forth, if you will, for motivation, incentive. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. He's still talking about the life that he is now choosing to live as a Christian. Though he is dead with Christ, he's living. But now he goes on to profile that life. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, notice, who loved me and gave Himself for me. I particularly like the wording of Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 because that's very personal, right? We've read Jesus died for us collectively. But here Paul makes it very personal. He loved me. He died for me. God knows. God knows that His Son, leaving heaven to come to this earth, ultimately to die by crucifixion, is the consummate manifestation of true love. And He knows how powerful that love is to instill within us a reciprocated love, finding us living a humble, obedient, God-pleasing life. Ricky, I am convinced that's part of God's wisdom in having us observe this commemorative feast every Lord's Day. I appreciate the song you led. Were you there? Were you there when He died for us? See, that's what God is inviting us to do each Lord's Day. Come together and go back to the cross and stand there. Remember what Jesus did. Why would God do that? Because He knows. He knows, like the songwriter, if that's not love, then there is nothing like love. If that's not love, you would have to deny every other reality. But that is love. That's the ultimate expression of love. And that's powerful. That's powerful. It's motivational. It's inspiring. It's the incentive we need. And so no surprise then in our ongoing study, and I hope you have your outline, but on our ongoing study, appreciate Ricky leading that song, there's not a friend like Jesus. That's what this study is all about. And at the top of the outline, our objective, we are seeking to identify, notice, some compelling reasons. See, that's the reason for this introduction. I was talking about reason for choosing to live for Christ. The compelling reasons. Motivation, inspiration, incentive. For what? For finding in Jesus a friend like no other. Now, in the process of doing that, we are hoping also to explore and discover some practical, meaningful realities that should favorably impact our daily lives because of the privilege of having a one-of-a-kind friend in Jesus. But hopefully you can understand why this now becomes a factor in this study. Because the first discovery we make is that Jesus is a friend like no other because He can enrich our lives. He can enrich our lives. We talked about how He does that with supreme possessions. We styled them supreme because they're enduring. They're not just physical. They're not just temporary. They're spiritual. They're eternal blessings. And they are innumerable. But then also He enriches our lives as a friend like no other because of the spiritual perspective He gives by means of His counsel. But now let me ask you to turn on the back of the page, because now we get to that third point in this. Because friends, Jesus is a friend who enriches our lives, yes, with supreme possessions, and yes, by means of a spiritual perspective, but He did that at a sacrificial price. Jesus is enriching our lives with supreme possessions, countless blessings, with a spiritual perspective, perfect counsel. He did that, but it came at a great cost. That should be a compelling reason to find in Jesus a friend like no other. That should be a truth that heightens our appreciation and our appraisal of Jesus as a friend. Because think with me, it's one thing to have a friend, an earthly friend, who can enrich our lives, let's say in a physical way, because of their wealth, and maybe because of their extraordinary wisdom. Again, these might have been qualities in those individuals that kind of attracted us to them, that caused us now to form this friendship. And it's one thing for them to enrich our lives because they're wealthy, because they're wise, but what if they're enriching our lives? Would have demanded on their part a considerable sacrifice. What if that wealthy friend discovers of my financial hardships? And what if those financial hardships are so severe that they're enriching my life, helping me, necessitated that they had to go into bankruptcy to give me what I needed? Would that make our appraisal of them even greater? Or what about wisdom? What about knowing that as their friend, I was in some mental distress and I needed help? But what if they were 3,000 miles away? And what if it was necessary for them to leave, disrupt their normal lives, and come to me and be in my presence to offer their counsel, to give me a clear perspective? Would that enhance your appraisal of that friend? Because it's no longer that they're just enriching our lives because they're wealthy, because they're wise, but now they're doing it at a considerable sacrifice. You know, in principle, this added dimension of sacrifice, I believe, is called to our attention by Jesus Himself. Let me direct you to Mark chapter 12 quickly. Mark chapter 12. It's an account in the life of Jesus that more than likely we are at least familiar with. But the closing verses of Mark chapter 12 recount for us what one commentator suggested would have been the last time Jesus would have been in the temple, at least that we have a record of. So this is very close to the end of His earthly sojourn. And He's in Jerusalem. But maybe for the last time He was in the temple. You might remember that last week He would clear the temple once again of the money changers and those who were profaning His Father's house. But on this occasion, He's sitting there and He's watching the activities of certain people. It has to do with their making contributions to the treasury that would have been used for the religious services and the needs to, as God had prescribed through the Old Testament. But notice what it says there, verse 41. And Jesus sat over against the treasury, and He beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. Friends, just to help us maybe understand that in our common current currency, I understand that a mite would have been somewhere between like 1/8 or maybe 1/5 of our cent. So 2 of these, making a farthing, would have been less than 1 of our pennies. This poor widow cast in, ostensibly, half a penny. Verse 43, Jesus called to him his disciples, and he says to them, Verily I say unto you that this poor widow has cast more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. Now, friends, if I understand that language as it seems to appear on the surface, Jesus is contrasting not what this widow gave in relationship and in contrast to what one rich individual gave, but to accumulatively all of those rich individuals who had cast in much. Jesus is contrasting what she gave to what they gave. Again, cumulatively. And in Jesus' appraisal, he said, that poor widow gave more than all the rest. Why? Verse 44, for all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want, of her lack, did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Friends, what was it that Jesus saw in that poor widow's contribution that made it so noteworthy? What is it? That last week of his earthly ministry? What is it that he saw in that poor widow's contribution that would have warranted his calling his disciples to come and witness this? Because we might have been impressed with all the contributions that were being made by the wealthy. Brother McGarvey in his commentary said, as he understood it, there would have been 13 chests, and on each of the chests there would have been like a horn-like mechanism in which you cast in your money, and it almost rumbles while it's going down through that funnel into the chest. And there would have been a lot of rattling, would have been a lot of rumbling going on as the wealthy were casting theirs in. A noisy activity compared to that poor widow. 2 small coins going in. But that's what Jesus says is praiseworthy. That's what is worthy of our imitating. In God's appraisal, that was more than what everyone else cast in. What was the dimension? What was the component of her contribution that would allow Jesus to make that appraisal? Was it not sacrifice? See, all the rest gave and really didn't feel it. You know, sometimes you feel when you give. They didn't feel it. They gave of their abundance. But she gave everything. No doubt attesting to her trust in God's care of her when she gave all of her living. I may have expressed this in the past, but if that's my mom, destitute, and I see her pull out her 2 last coins and ready to cast them in, I'm thinking my counsel would be, Mom, why don't you put one of them in? No doubt that's something. And God would count that considerable. You're giving half of what you have. But Jesus commended her giving it all because of the sacrifice that it was. So I'm suggesting Jesus understands sacrifice and how that should be attractive to us. how that should endear us. And so now I'm asking us in a similar way to think about the sacrificial price that was required in Jesus' enriching our lives with those supreme possessions, with that spiritual perspective. And as we think about that sacrifice that was involved, like that poor widow, we ought to be attracted to that. That ought to enhance our appraisal of Him as our friend. Because what a cost it was. Let's just read a few passages together that really drive that home. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, please. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. The Apostle Paul here is again speaking on the subject of giving. He's urging those at Corinth to make good on their pledge, their promise of a year ago to make a contribution to help the impoverished saints back in Judea. And he's using a number of, again, motivations, incentives, compelling reasons as to why they should be liberal in their giving. He calls attention by way of an example of those in Macedonia who were far less blessed than those in Corinth. They are themselves in poverty, and yet they gave themselves. But as he is looking for motivation, as he is helping them to find incentive to give liberally, what greater example could have he used than Jesus himself? And that's what he does in verse 9. He says, "For you know, as Christians you are well aware of this, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ," look at the language, "that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might be rich." You see how that fits into that paradigm that I was talking about? You're having a wealthy friend, knowing of your financial destitution, and yet he himself goes into bankruptcy, giving his wealth away to you, making you rich, but himself becoming poor. See, that's what Jesus did. As our friend, that's what Jesus did for us. Burton Kaufman, in his commentary, really helps us appreciate what this is that Paul is talking about. The riches of Christ, quote, he says, "The riches of Christ are those riches which pertain to his status with God and equality to God before the world was. The riches of his eternal power and Godhead. The riches of his everlasting divinity and glory." That has to be what he's alluding to, because Jesus was never rich while on the earth as it pertains to material riches. He didn't have a place to lay his head. He was relying on other people to sustain his life. The riches that he possessed was his eternal glory. He surrendered that. He gave up those riches, himself becoming poor, so that we could be rich. And I do appreciate this. Brother Kaufman says, "For your sakes, it should ever be remembered that Christ forsook heaven with its glory to live upon earth with its shame in order to redeem men from the curse of sin. It was not merely for the sake of the Corinthians, but for the sake of every man, that he thus humbled himself, took upon him the form of a servant, was found obedient even to the death on the cross." See, again, that makes it personal. That makes it Galatians 2:20. He died for me. He gave his life for me. Obviously, Brother Kaufman was alluding to the wording of Philippians 2. who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. He made himself of no reputation. He took upon him the form of a servant, was made in likeness as of men. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Friends, that language, he emptied himself. That corresponds to Jesus' becoming poor. That beckons back to the lyrics of that song, he left heaven, knowing his destiny. I am fully of the conviction that the finite mind cannot fully comprehend what that emptying entailed. We might be able to grasp it on one level, but those self-imposed limitations, the surrendering of the glory that he possessed in heaven to temporarily come to this earth so that we could be enriched. You see, friends, without Jesus' making that sacrifice, those riches that we were talking about, forgiveness, reconciliation, and inheritance, none of that would be available. Had Jesus not left heaven to come to earth to live among men, we would not have seen his spiritual perspective. We would not have known it as clearly as we do because he came to the earth to live it out among men. Friends, these passages should impress upon us that Jesus, our friend, was willing to become poor so that we could be rich. Being God, he was willing to empty himself for the sole purpose of enriching us, giving us supreme possessions, countless blessings, making available to us that spiritual perspective that would enrich our lives not only here but ultimately in heaven. See, friends, this sacrificial price that was paid by Jesus goes to the very heart of what he said to his disciples when he informed them that they are his friends. Remember what he said? John 15. Greater love has no man than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. See, that's what he was affirming. That's what he was attesting to. I'm going to do that, and in that demonstration, I am going to show you unequivocally, undeniably, the consummate expression of love. But then to understand that Jesus' love even went beyond that because he died for his enemies. Romans chapter 5. He died for us while we were his enemies, not while we were his friends. What a friend we have in Jesus, Ricky. What a friend. Not a friend like him. And so, are we looking for a friend who can truly enrich our lives? If I can borrow the lyrics of another spiritual song, I'll be a friend to Jesus. You might remember it says, to all who need a Savior, my friend I'll recommend. Because he brought salvation, is why I am his friend. See, Jesus, at a great sacrificial price, offers to enrich our lives. Supreme possessions, providing a spiritual perspective through his counsel that will enrich our lives beyond my capability to adequately convey it to you. And again, he offers these enriching blessings to everyone, but each of us must choose to avail it for ourselves. But why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we? Isn't that attractive? Isn't that appealing? Isn't that motivational? To know that somebody could love me that much, that he would be willing to enrich my life by himself becoming poor. But Jesus says, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. See, that's how we show that we want to be his friends He's proven himself our friend at a great price. And all he asks of us is for us to accept his offer, live a life of obedience to him. That begins by our obeying the gospel, if you've never done that. Believing that Jesus is the Son of God who left heaven, come to this earth, died ultimately so that we could have eternal life. It's believing that. It's believing that he died, rose again from the dead, and now reigns at the right hand of God the Father. Because of that faith, then confessing my faith in him and changing my life, choosing to live differently because of what he's done for me, with the promise of eternal life when this life is over. See, that's where it begins. But then each day we have to make those decisions. Again, one of the reasons I believe God is constantly keeping before us, by means of the Lord's Supper, by means of the instructions and exhortations of the New Testament, ever keeping before us, that he left his home in heaven, knowing his destiny, was the lonely cross of Golgotha, there to die on the cross for me. And brethren, if that's not love, there's no such thing.